some of us, even in the best of homes, grew up where it was like, no, all of that was spiritual. All of that, just pray that away. Just choose joy. It's mind over matter. And it's like, well, actually, it's not.
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. Today, I've got Dr. Alison Cook, and we're going to talk about, among other things, why therapy has become the new church. Today's episode is brought to you by GLOO. Don't let your message fade into the background. Sign up for free texting with GLOO today at gloo.us/free texting and by Compassion. Man, I love Compassion. Watch how God uses your church to impact the world when you host a Compassion Sunday. Find out more at compassion.com/Carey. And hey, if you're brand new to YouTube, make sure you subscribe. You know, the vast majority of you who watch these episodes don't subscribe. So if you do that, you'll never miss another one. And now my conversation with Dr. Alison Cook on why therapy has become the new church. Alison, it's great to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
I am so glad to be here, Carey. I really appreciate this podcast. It's one of the ones that I let inform me. So I appreciate being here with you.
Well, that's humbling to hear and great to know. And you have what did you just tell me? A PhD in religious psychology? What is it?
Yeah, I have a master's degree in counseling as well as a PhD. It's a joint degree in psychology and religion. So technically, wow. I am a psychologist of religion. So I like to study both, which is very culturally relevant right now. But I'm a therapist. I'm a licensed therapist, but I went on to do extra work because I'm fascinated by that interplay between psychology and religion.
So what does that involve? I'm just really curious.
A lot of the history of psychology, right? So clinical psychology or the practice of therapy, you're really studying kind of modalities, how to intervene, how to help people reframe thoughts, heal trauma. But the psychology of religion is really getting at the larger, broader history, going back to, and it's really important and I think really relevant to churches in a way where religious institutions, church institutions were the primary shaping influence on culture and on humans for centuries. And then Freud came in, William James came in, some of these early psychologists came in with this other way of wait, let's look at the human psyche, right? And that became a hugely shaping influence on culture. And from my little vantage point, when I started out with all this was like, aren't both important, right? Don't we need both? And so the study of psychology and religion is kind of studying the overlaps and intersections of how the two fields kind of shape culture, shape human selves.
Well, it's sort of an interesting juxtaposition because I think there's an argument that therapy is the new religion. Basically, I don't go to church, I go to therapy, right? The two seem to be probably more connected. And then we'll get into this, but you have a lot of what I call pop therapists in the pulpit, people who didn't actually study the craft, but think that they know about it. Why has therapy gotten so big over the last little while?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think if you just look at the numbers, first of all, there's no doubt it has. I think the latest study showed that it's the number of people in therapy, the number of adults in the US has doubled in the last 2 decades. It's extremely more than, I think it's a quarter of the population is in therapy, and that's way higher among Gen Z and millennials. It's probably more than half. So it is true that therapy has just skyrocketed in its role in the culture. There's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, I think as sort of a historian, when I look at the big picture, I think some of it is that he's amazing. I am primarily a psychologist. And so for me, I see the deficits, but I also see the good in it. There's some amazing things we've learned about attachment, about emotions, about the way that trauma and pain lives in the body and the nervous system. There's a lot of things we've discovered through psychology that I think has trickled down into the culture, right? In the 60s and 70s, it was sort of at the thought level. And then suddenly we started learning, oh my goodness, I need to parent my kids differently. I need to think about that secure attachment. I need to be aware of emotions. I need to not be shaming kids, right? And so we're seeing that trickle effect into the culture of really good things, right? There's a lot of good there that we understand trauma better. We understand the effect on the nervous system and on the self. We understand shame better, the neurobiology of shame, the problems with shame. And so a lot of this, I think, is hopeful, again, from that therapeutic perspective where we're just more aware of the role of anxiety. We're more aware of some of these terms. And so we're wanting to utilize these resources that are available to us. Therapy is also more available. Online therapy, it's more common, it's more prevalent. And so some of that, I think we're just seeing the culture catch up to what's been happening over the last century in the field. I think where it's become the new religion is sort of where we start to see this maybe overcorrection in the sense of, even as a therapist, I'll say to you, Carey, I am keenly aware that I am not a replacement for belonging. I'm not a replacement for a family. I'm not a replacement for a neighborhood, for a church community. And that while we do need focus and attention on the individual psyche, the individual self, we also need to be in community with others. And we also need to be in relationship with God. And so that's where I think there's really an interesting cultural moment with this prevalence, this skyrocketing of therapy, and sort of over here kind of going, wait a minute, what happens with the church? What happens there? Is it now obsolete? Is it now irrelevant? I would argue, no, absolutely not. But there is an interesting moment that's in front of us, I think, collectively.
Okay, I'd love to play a little game with you and see if you're up for it. Let's because you've got training in both of these areas. Let's do therapy without the church. So you think about the rise of secularism. Someone goes to therapy, they're like, yeah, I'm recovering from trauma. I understand that the body keeps score. I know I'm struggling with anxiety and depression, but like God is not a part of that equation, which is a lot of secular therapy, right? It's like, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to do this without the spiritual component. Where does that lead? What's missing?
Yeah, the hyper laser focus on the self, capital S self, leads ultimately to chaos. We cannot exist as a capital S self. And listen, my first book is a Christian, a theologically based adaptation of a very popular model of therapy in the culture. It's called Internal Family Systems, IFS. You'll hear about it. Probably a lot of your listeners have heard about it. It's a phenomenal modality. It works. But the model is centered on this idea of a capital S self that is the regulating force. And, my co-author and I were like, wow, there's a lot about this that works. And also, that's a problem because the way that I look at it, and I base this on Jesus' greatest command, love the Lord your God. There's 3 primary relationships that we're responsible for. Love the Lord your God, love others as yourself. Now that self piece, I will say for centuries, was sidelined by a lot of times by religious institutions. True. I think that's part of why we're seeing the overcorrection. That self piece does matter, but it is not to the exclusion of the relationship with God and the relationship to others. All 3 have to be held in tension. So a little bit about what I see happening is we've overemphasized the self. We've removed it from God and sometimes from others, right? I just live in my little silo where everything kind of plays to what works for me or doesn't work for me, which is not healthy. That is not how the human soul is designed to thrive. And it's not working out so well. And I see that in numerous ways. So there has to be a way to bring that self into tension, into a healthy relationship, into a healthy balance with God and with others. And that's kind of where I see an invitation for us as a body of believers.
So you say it leads to chaos.
Yeah.
So let's play that out a little bit, all right? Because it's very interesting. I don't think it's correlative, not causative, but if you look at the decline of religion, so many other things have risen to fill that vacuum. And I think you can make a plausible argument that therapy is one of them, that we know we're missing something. And I'm not saying that therapy doesn't add a lot to it. I've been in therapy off and on for 20 plus years. So, I mean, I'm, not just the president, I'm a client, right? Kind of thing. I'm not the president, but you know what I mean? Yeah. I believe in it. But if that's all you have, what does the chaos look like?
I think that we have to hold two things in tension. There's the needs of the self and there's the needs of the group at its basest form. And the group might be a church group, the group might be a family, the group might be a marriage, the group might be a friend group. We have to hold those two things in tension. We know from research that we were not designed to live out of relationship with other people. We have to live in relationship. Take out religion for a minute. We just know that to be true. In order for me to be in relationship with you, I have to have a strong sense of myself, and I have to have an ability to care about, to honor, to respect, and to negotiate with you, right? And you and I become greater than the sum of our individual selves. So chaos, when you ask about chaos, if I am primarily only concerned about what is best for me, what brings, what is best for me, what are my needs, what are my preferences, what are my opinions, and I don't bring that into tension with someone else, with another human, with another group, with a collective, there is nowhere I can ultimately go with that. That is an endless black hole. It's an endless black hole of my own whims, needs, impulses, desires. There's no regulating force on that. And, it has to be held in tension. I think about marriage, or I think about any close friendship where it's like, there are times when, yes, my preference is X, but because I love this other person, I am going to agree to do Y in this case, right? I'm aware of my own preference, and also I'm going to set that aside in the service of this relationship because I want this relationship to work. That applies on a macrocosm as well. It applies to a community. It applies to a country. There have to be sort of group norms, group regulating influences that hold us together. And what we're getting at is this whole kind of biblical theme of diversity within unity. We have to have that unifying force to bring together the individuals. Sometimes I think about it almost like an orchestra. We each have to play our individual role, but if I'm so hyper-focused on my own role as the violin that I just no longer even care about trying to attune my instrument with the other instruments around me, I can't create a melody half or a quarter as beautiful if I bring my instrument into a beautiful melody with yours and 10 other people and 20 other people and a whole nation of other people, right? So I'm still myself, but I'm playing in concert with lots of other people, and we can create something so much better. In order to do that, we have to have some governing forces. We have to have some group norms. We have to have a unifying force. Both things have to be held in tension.
That's a great analysis. So let's play the other side of the game. And I think some of us know this from memory too, because I was just speaking to a group of church leaders in England, and there was, 800, 1,000 of them. And we were just chatting over the course of an afternoon about mental health and burnout and so on and so forth. And the number of times I still hear, like in 2024, that there's a stigma about going to counseling, that there's a stigma in the church. So I remember that very vividly. I think it was 2003, the first time I went to counseling. I had to get over my own stigma, but it's still there. So the other side of the game is, you have therapy without God, but then you have God with no therapy. In other words, that's nothing we believe in at all here in the church. And there's still little pockets where you can find that, but it's largely been normalized, I think, in our lifetime. But what happens if you back out of therapy and just say, no, we got to make this all about, it's all spiritual. It's all spiritual.
Yeah, that's equally problematic, right? And again, It goes back to those three primary relationships, God, others, and self. We have to have a relationship and cultivate a relationship with all three, right? And if we remove that self piece, we're at risk for codependency. We're at risk for instead of group norms and sort of a unifying force, group think, where I just take on your beliefs because I don't know how to think critically for myself. We're at risk of, high control, where we defer, we outsource our own autonomy and our own agency to other people who may or may not have our best interests at heart. So there's a lot of problems with...
Yeah, you just described a lot of the problems in the church right now. Congratulations. Yeah, you're right. That's a challenge. And you also write, you got a section in your new book about spiritual bypassing. I've seen that happen a lot too. What do you mean by that term, and what's at stake with it?
Yeah, we spiritualize. Again, if we remove that self piece and we think everything is spiritual, we apply spiritual solutions to problems that are not spiritual. And, we don't do this so much with medicine anymore, in the sense of if a parishioner were to come and be dealing with cancer, yes, we might pray for them. And also we would work really hard to help connect them to medical care. We would understand that. And I think in mental health, that's one of the areas, again, where there's this tension where folks in the last 2 decades in particular have started to learn, oh my goodness, I have anxiety. There's a way that my brain functions, or there's a way that my nervous system functions that's not my fault. And that isn't primarily spiritual at root. In fact, that there are things I can do. And so then, especially those of us, again, I think the church is sort of catching up. I think there's a little bit of a catching up that the church is doing to the science and to the psychology of some of us, even in the best of homes, grew up where it was like, no, all of that was spiritual. All of that, just pray that away. Just choose joy. It's mind over matter. And it's like, well, actually, it's not. It's actually something that is living in my body. The pain that I experience is actually living in my body. It's a nervous system response that I actually don't have control over. And I have to actually do that deeper work of healing that so that I can get myself to the point of regulating those emotions. And so I think that's a little bit of where the church is catching up to some of us. Folks have gotten that different languaging, that different emphasis to understand the root causes of some of these mental illnesses, of some of these trauma, these behaviors and these reactions that are rooted in trauma that are far less about morality, have nothing to do with morality or spirituality, and have a lot to do with our physiology and the neurobiology and how we function. And then we're confused. There's a lot of dissonance inside. We go to church and we're like, but how do I assimilate what I'm hearing here with what I'm learning here, right? And so the spiritual bypassing is where sometimes I post about spiritual bypassing, and it always is, these are the posts of mine that go crazy because it's sort of the difference between just let go and let God versus I'm learning to be gentle with myself as I wrestle with some worry, or, I'm learning to get the care that I need through this experience of depression versus what's wrong with your faith, which is a spiritualizing of a problem that is in fact just a very real thing that I'm working through that has a lot of different root causes for it.
So I have been guilty of this in the past, and I hope I'm getting better, but I'd love for you, like probably doing some spiritual bypassing. I've told people, I'm thinking back a few years now, well, you just need to pray harder. And I don't believe that I believe you should pray hard. I don't think that's going to solve some of the challenges that maybe get presented. But for pastors who are in the habit, you get tens of thousands of pastors listening right now, who are in the habit of their standard thing. You got to read your Bible more. You got to pray more. You just got to have more faith. You got to believe more. You got to try harder. What are some better phrases when you're faced with a difficult situation? Because when I look back on it, if I had to exegete myself, just being transparent, I probably didn't know what to say in those situations in the first few years of ministry. I just didn't know. And I'm like, well, have you tried prayer? And then I'm out of that conversation into a next one. Meanwhile, I'm trying to solve a problem that's been going on for 30 years. And listen, I pray every day. I believe in prayer. Please don't misunderstand. But if you're in the habit of being a spiritual bypasser, pray harder. You got to join a group. Which I believe in. I'm part of a group. But if we only have spiritual answers, what would you say for that person who, every time they give an answer, it tends to be pray harder, believe more, have more faith, trust more?
Yeah, I appreciate your sharing about that personally, and I have a lot of empathy and compassion for pastors because a lot of that does come out of I want to help.
Yeah.
At its best, that is coming from a place of I want to help. Right?
And I don't know how to.
And I don't know how. And
don't
this
know what
is
to
what's
do with
worked for me, right?
that.
Potentially.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think, and I say this to everybody, and I think it perhaps particularly applies to a pastor, is getting curious about that nervousness around maybe not having the solution. What if my presence, my loving presence with this person is what this person needs the most? What if my curiosity is what this person needs the most? Tell me more. I'm interested. I care. I don't have the solutions. I'm not sure, but I do care and I do want to know more, right? What if we shifted into a little bit more curiosity? That would be freeing for us, I think, as leaders, as caregivers. I know as a therapist, that's a huge part of our training, right? We're trying always to get curious. I don't necessarily have the answers. I'm going to listen. I'm going to attune with you, and together, let's think through together, what might be a next step for you to take? And that's a little bit of the process I talk about. And I shouldn't feel this way. We're naming the facts. What are some of the facts? Tell me more. We're framing it. I'm curious. I want to understand more. And then, yes, we will take a brave step together. There's that sense of being together, of partnership, of collaboration versus power over. Right? I don't have to have the answers. I'm not your expert. I'm not. And that's true in my profession as therapist, but it's also true, I think, as a pastor, that's relieving. I don't have to be the expert in this situation. I'm here with you to ask questions. And so I would say, ask a question, get curious. I'm curious, and say right up front, I don't have the answers. I don't know. I want to listen. I want to hear more. And together, putting yourself as a collaborator versus an expert can be so helpful to the other person and also helpful to the leader, to the pastor.
That's very helpful. And, I think I'm getting closer to that all the time, just being really comfortable saying, I don't know, or, what, we should pray about this, but I think this probably goes deeper than just having a prayer, and maybe you need to talk to somebody. But that's really good advice. So thank you for that. I want to take it from, so there's one hand, it's the spiritual answer is everything. You just got to pray more. On the other hand, I think there's something about the last 5 years. Maybe we all had time during lockdown to go read some extra books or whatever, but I see a lot of non-PhDs, like generally educated pastors who are now, quote, experts on brain trauma or therapy or whatever. And it always makes me a little bit nervous, just being candid, that it's like sometimes you see people overstepping into the realm of therapy without the training behind it. They read a couple of good books, they've watched some documentaries or videos, and it's working its way into books now, it's working its way into sermons on a regular basis. I guess my question is, how do you know your lane? How do you stick to your lane and your expertise when perhaps you're not? Like, for example, and again, confession time. Didn't expect this to be a confession. I talk about burnout a lot. When I'm talking to crowds and in my writing, I'm like, look, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a licensed therapist, but I've been through this and I've hit the wall and I've counseled thousands of people. Here are a few things I'm learning, and please go see a professional. So I try to caveat that with when I talk about things like burnout and exhaustion in leadership. But what would you say to people who are all of a sudden overnight experts on brain trauma and, all the things we need to do with our morning routine that science shows, et cetera, et cetera? Any thoughts if they don't have training in that area?
Yeah, I appreciate your naming that. And I appreciate even your own experience with that, because listen, there's hard-earned wisdom that matters. And hard-earned wisdom doesn't necessarily require a PhD. You can have a PhD and not have hard-earned wisdom. So there's the wisdom of the trenches. True. There's the wisdom of a life that is deeply formed and deeply lived in connection with God and in connection with others. So I honor that. And I also think there is a culture where a lot of information is not transformation, right? We can have a lot of head knowledge. We can have a lot of facts. We can have a lot of data and have no clue about the deeper work of transformation. Transformation is messy. It's nuanced. There is no one size fits all. There is no easy 5 steps. There just isn't. It doesn't exist. You can read the easy 5 steps and they can make logical sense, but living that out is really complicated and messy, and there is no way to actually get that into your psyche, deep into your soul, but through living it out in the context of real life relationships. And so I think what we do is we deprive ourselves of deep transformational work, right? We're just so quick to, I've got the information now, put it back out versus letting that information marinate deeply into the soul and into the psyche, and maybe taking a few years to seeing how it really plays itself out in our relationships, and taking our time with that slow nature of growth. So some of the information you see, it's not that it's bad. It's just not steeped in the depth. And I think, to be honest, that's what our culture is actually hungry for, is that real evidence, especially those younger, the Gen Z and the millennials, of a deeply formed life where the words might even be the same on some level, but the what we're aware of is the authenticity, the deep groundedness, the wisdom, the compassion, the humility of that life that has been deeply formed and deeply transformed. I think we are so in dire, aching hunger for more of that. So I think that's what we get deprived of in this sort of age of sort of pop psychology and lots of information. My brain gets tired when I go on social media. I see all the memes and all the stuff, especially in psychology. And I think, gosh, there's some good data here, but how am I actually applying that and letting that change and inform my very real life?
I'll put in a good word for what you just said. I think going deep is becoming a superpower.
Yeah.
I've been thinking a lot this year about zigging when everyone else is zagging. And if zag is, I just learned something and now I'm going to tell the world and I'm going to be an expert on this and I'm going to do that. I was like, okay, if that's zagging, I think I'd like to do some zigging and try to figure out how to go deep on a subject and how to really let it sink in and field test it a little bit more, et cetera. So yeah, you've
very
got
countercultural.
It's very countercultural. And I think at the end of the day, countercultural wins most of the time. It really does. Like, I'm not saying, the culture is all bad or anything, but I think it's very helpful. You got a phrase in the book I just couldn't let go. It's called, you say, compulsive availability. And when I read that, I'm like, gosh, I think that is a disease for church leaders, compulsive availability. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I see it in my own life. I went through a season of really detoxing because I became aware of that constant pinging and responding. I think it's exacerbated in the hyper age of information. I was talking with a friend recently about birthdays, and I don't mean this. I'm so grateful when people text me on a birthday, but we were talking about the burden of getting, so now we text a friend, happy birthday. So you might get, or Facebook, right? You get 100 messages and you feel obligated to respond to every single one. And I found myself yearning for the old days of getting a couple of cards in the mail that require no response. It's a literal gift, right? and so I don't even think it's just social media. I think we're just constantly, if I get a text that demands an automatic response. And I have really worked in my own life to wean myself and the people in my life from that need for an automatic reply. It gets at our prior conversation. And when you do it, it's work. It's soul work to say, I am only and truly available in these channels and in these ways and at these times. My whole nervous system settles in. I am going to give you a better, wiser, more authentic, more genuine, more nourishing response, which means you're going to have to cultivate some patience. And that's not also going to be bad for you. Right? So we have to do our work, which means the folks around us are going to have to do their work to tolerate the discomfort of a delay. Right? And there's a lot of deep breaths for all of us as we're re-regulating our nervous systems to a more sustainable pace of life. Again, I think it's countercultural. It can feel in the moment like, oh my goodness, nobody is going to want to come to me anymore, or I'm going to lose some perhaps leadership, authority, or I'm going to lose, if you're on social media saying you're not responding to people, I'm going to lose followers. But I do believe in the long run that more grounded, present, being very mindful of your availability. When am I available and when am I not? And what channels do I have to close down to enforce that very mindfully in my life will make me not only a better human, but a better leader, someone who will actually have more to give and more to say when the time is right.
It's an interesting observation about birthdays. I took my birthday offline this year. I mean, I'm sure it's still available somewhere, but like I didn't acknowledge it on social media because it had become the you've got to now answer hundreds of DMs kind of day. And I thought, there's a few people who know it's my birthday. They're my friends. They're going to reach out to me. I'm going to spend it with people close to me. And I've taken a lot of the public holidays offline, even posting on them, because I want to savor those as personal celebrations, not with the people that I really know, you know?
Yeah.
Pastoral availability, though, like compulsive availability is an issue for pastors. And we had Cal Newport on, and I kind of ran the problem by him, and he had some fascinating things to say. But I'd love your take, Alison. So pastors, I mean, when I was pastoring at the beginning, you know, there was a telephone and there was an email, and that was it. And now there's like 17 different inboxes that pastors can be hit with, and their parishioners don't know their day off. So how would you advise pastors? And a lot of them really have a desire to please. It's like, I want to be there for my church. I want to be there for my people. And they're trying to get a day off. They're trying to get a week at the lake with their family. And like, their phone's blowing up. What would you say about boundaries for pastors who struggle with compulsive availability? Both the expectation that they're going to be there, and secondly, their personal desire to not let anybody down.
Yeah, I get it. It's so real. I would say a couple of things. One, more is caught than taught. That's true as a parent, and I think it's true as a pastor. There's a way in which you modeling what it's like to truly inhabit a spaciousness, a pace of life that is sustainable is the best gift you have to give your congregation, is the best gift you have to give to the people that you serve. They may not see that in the short run, and you may need to train them, right? Or, you may need to help them understand, right? That the best way I can serve you is to stay really healthy within my own capacity, within my own healthy boundaries. And so to reframe it in your mind from, I'm not making myself less available. I'm not being a worse pastor. I'm not being a worse friend. I'm actually trying to model and show really healthy leadership, which is the more I am really aware with God, with the people in my life, my closest relationships, my family, my kids, my marriage, my closest friends, as I am really mindful of that capacity, of that spaciousness that I need, the more I model how to live within that in a healthy way, the more I am showing and demonstrating a healthier way for you. And that can be counterintuitive to our systems. We think the best way to help people is to be compulsively available to them, right? But it requires that humility of, oftentimes I'll say to people, a need is not necessarily a call. And it requires us to put that Holy Spirit led buffer between us and all the needs, which forces us to go to God, right? There's other people out there. God, I cannot meet. I talk a lot about guilt-driven love, those inner guilt trippers that a lot of us have that are just badgering us to meet all the needs, and to reframe that guilt as, am I actually doing something wrong here? Or am I doing something really brave? Which is to set myself out of the equation for a second and say, God, these are my limitations. You are God. I am not. This is what I need to do to be healthy before you. I believe this is the best gift I have to give other people. It's a real reframe that we have to do inside of ourselves. But again, I think it's counterculture, and I think it's really solid, healthy leadership.
All right. Well, you open your book, I Shouldn't Feel This Way, talking about the mental game and our thoughts. And I thought it was really interesting because I don't see a lot written about this, but you talk about the escape that a lot of people have. Like, what would my life be if I wasn't in this job? What if I just quit ministry tomorrow? Like, so many pastors I've talked to have dream jobs, and their dream job could be I mow lawns for a living, or I stack boxes in a warehouse, or, I'm doing something else with my life. It's just like, this is hard. I can imagine something else. You talk about a different life, a different partner, a different spouse, a different reality. I think a lot of us have been caught up in those thoughts from time to time. Why is that normal or abnormal? It was really interesting to see someone name it. It's like, oh, okay. So
I think it's very normal. I think most people have some form of escape artist, inner fantasy life, inner what if my life could be. And I think we don't want to shame ourselves for that. I think shame makes it worse. When we shame ourselves from those parts of ourselves, we cut ourselves off from healing that we need. I think it's a cue. I think those things are cues to get curious about. That's a big theme in all of my work. I wonder what that's about, because I also almost always, there's another conflicting thought, but I love my wife, or I love my spouse, or I want to do this work. So there's a couple of things going on here. Again, to the whole theme of this, it's a cue to slow ourselves down and give ourselves a little bit more spaciousness. It's a cue that maybe there's another part of us that is hurting, or is overwhelmed, or is anxious, or is feeling overtaxed, or unseen, or invisible, or unappreciated. And that part of us needs attention and care. It doesn't need to be sidelined or shamed or cut off from ourselves. And so it really is, again, to go back to our original conversation, the self, this relationship we have with ourself is so important, not at the exclusion of God or others, but it's a cue about the relationship that's going on inside of me. Some part of me is resorting an awful lot to a fantasy life. Some part of me is resorting an awful lot. I need to name that without shame, slow things down, get curious about that, because I don't want that to take me over. I also want to understand the information or the hurt or the ache that is underneath that.
So how do you know? It is normal, I guess you're saying, for people to have it. How do you know? Is there a level at which it's like you're thinking about it every day, or you're thinking about it too often, where you really have to take action on it and do something about it? Like, any idea on that?
Yeah, I think when that part of us gets extreme, it could be numbing or distracting or fantasizing or trying to escape. That part of us gets extreme when we are doing things we feel like we shouldn't be doing, number one. And that's a cue that it's out of whack. It's not just a fleeting thought or a fleeting moment. And then pretty quickly we go, oh gosh, I love this life. It's hard, but I love it, right? That's normal. When it becomes chronic, when we can't come out of it, when we find ourselves getting resentful about the very people we're trying to serve, that's a pretty big cue, and so that there's that escape, and then there's that resentment, and it's not going away. Or there's that escape and there's that depression, and it's not going away. We don't wake up after a good night's sleep feeling more refreshed, more invigorated, right? It's there day after day after day. So how it's manifesting in our behaviors, and the consistency and chronic nature of it over time, that's where it gets more serious, where we might want to talk to a therapist. We might want to name it in a safe place.
No, that's very, very helpful. So Craig Rochelle says your life goes in the direction of your strongest thoughts. How do you hang on to, you've got some cognitive dissonance. And I just want to drill down a little bit more on that. How much cognitive dissonance between what you know and what you believe and what you're feeling is normative for leaders? Because I have seen this come up again and again in pastors. I think honestly, it's in business leadership. It's probably just natural to being human, et cetera. But when you have that kind of cognitive dissonance, not necessarily even in the direction of an escape life, but something else, what is normative and what is not normative?
Do you mean something, I think there are a million ways to apply this, but do you mean something like if you're a pastor and you're pastoring someone and you're maybe preaching a message and you're struggling with doubt, or you're struggling with unforgiveness, or you're actually struggling with something yourself, even as you're trying to teach other people about a concept, something like that.
Or you're like half engaged in your job. You know you should be more grateful. There's nothing, quote, wrong, but you're just sort of struggling where your thought life is not lining up with your real life.
Yeah. I think it's completely normal. I think pastors are humans like anybody else. As a therapist, I can speak to the dissonance. I tried to show it throughout the book. Even as a therapist, a client will tell me something and I'll have conflicting thoughts about it. I think the more we're aware of the dissonance, the more we're aware of it, again, without shame, the more we're going to be healthy in the dissonance. I think we all experience it on multiple levels. It's part of the human condition. It's part of the awareness of, we have those moments of flow where we are just in it with someone and we're aware of the spirit, or we're aware where everything is aligning, and we have those moments. But I think those moments are the exception, not the norm. And it's wonderful when we have those moments. But even if you look at an athlete, right, they'll say, yes, I get those moments of flow. And a lot of it is just grit. It's perseverance. And so I think it's the same with any leader. We get those moments that are amazing. And a lot of it is, okay, I'm showing up here aware that a part of me is distracted. A part of me isn't here. And the more we're actually aware of that dissonance, we don't have to fix it. There's an authenticity in that. There's an authenticity, even if it's internal, even if we're not saying it to the other person, even if we're saying, even internally, we're like, I'm giving it my best to this person, even though I'm aware that I'm also really tired. Today, I'm also really overwhelmed. Today, there's a compassion that you have toward yourself. God knows that. And there's a way in which you're showing up more authentically, even by just honoring that within yourself. So I think it's very common. I think it's very normal. I think where it gets abnormal is when we try to shove it aside, where we try to pretend like it's not there, where we try to put ourselves out there as the hero, as the expert, as the person who always has it together. I think that's where problems arise, not in the experience of dissonance in and of itself.
So you've mentioned shame a number of times so far in our conversation, and I want to spend a minute on that, because if there's one thing we're really good at in the church, it's shaming others and shaming ourselves. We do a good job. Yeah. And yet we sing about, my shame was nailed to the cross. So we believe that. We believe that there shouldn't be shame, but shame is something so many people struggle with, particularly in a Christian or religious context. Shame is so huge. So if we're not to shame ourselves for that, what do you do instead? Like, what is a good, healthy substitute for shame?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is an area where I think a lot of the secular research and the psychology around shame has really been helpful, in the sense of, there's a great book by Kurt Thompson, a good friend of mine, The Soul of Shame, that really gets at the neurobiology of shame from a theological perspective. It's a fantastic book that I would encourage any pastor to read. And Kurt refers to shame as evil's vector. And I really tend to agree with him. I think shame is this whole body neurological feeling of, I am not worthy to exist on this planet. I should be swallowed up and die. It is vicious in its whole body. There's a neurobiology of it that he lays out that is just powerful. And you read it and you're like, yeah, that's shame. And it is not, there's not truth in it. There's not, and I think there's something to it, that it really is the tool that the enemy of our soul uses to shame us, right? To keep us away from other people, right? Shame keeps us, we want to go crawl under a rock and hide. It doesn't turn us toward other people. It doesn't turn us toward God. It turns us inward, to just crawl. And it's not constructive, right? And I think that understanding of shame has been a real contribution. Brene Brown writes a lot about shame in a way that has permeated the culture, I think, in such a helpful way, right? And so I think, again, for those of us in church communities, you're asking a great question. So well, but wait a minute, we do need to feel conviction. We do need to feel that sense of, oh, I've done something wrong. And what I would argue, and what I try to argue in the book, is when we become people who can name what's true without shame. We have so much more power, including in myself, right? So I might have that feeling of a little bit of shame, or feeling of, guilt, or that feeling of the sting, the prick of a conscience. We want that, right? We want that. This is why guilt is an emotion. We have to frame that guilt though, right? We have to be able to keep that guilt, right? So it's almost like you're trying to parse out, okay, what's the actual thing, the conviction, the Holy Spirit-led conviction, removing that shame from it. This is what's true in this moment. I yelled at my kids. I want to shame myself for that. I want to just swallow up in a whole, but if I can actually remove the shame, and this takes Holy Spirit-led skills. Sometimes I call it core strength versus big biceps, right? This is core strength. It's sitting with the shame without taking it in, becoming aware of it, while simultaneously also honoring the truth of the conviction. I shouldn't have done that. I wish I just lied to that person's face. What was going on, right? Without the shame, just with the truth. And this is a lost art in our culture today, right? Because we throw out the conviction with the shame, but we're trying to parse out two very different things. I did do this thing. I am feeling this way. I wish I didn't. I am. It doesn't mean that I am a horrible human being that should be thrown off the face of the planet. It means something hard is happening, and I actually need to turn towards safe people to talk about it, because shame dies in the context of loving community. Right. And so it's huge in the church. I think the more we can remove shame and turn toward each other's in the pain of our humanity, in the pain of the things we get wrong, we are going to be so much more equipped to grow and toward that transformation thing we talked about, right? Versus the quick memes, the real transformation.
Okay. I just ordered The Soul of Shame. I've heard so much about that book, and I have so many mutual friends who know Kurt.
Yeah.
I'll have to get him on the show.
Kurt's
that would be great.
You'll love him.
That'll be fantastic. So I've heard from so many of my friends. Thank you. That was really helpful. And I think the insight, there is, you're right. Shame does make you turtle. You just go inside, and then you never deal with the issue.
Exactly.
You just eventually get over it, and then you do it again, and it gets worse. And, but it's like, why do I do that? Get curious about yourself. I love that. That's fantastic. So in your book, you've got a frame, and you really frame a reality. Can you walk us through it? You've got this 3-step process and everything, and just give us the model. And then I want to work through a couple of different issues with it.
Yeah, what I've noticed in years of clinical practice, working with leaders, working with ministry leaders, working with clients, working with myself, is we need to be able to name, kind of what I'm saying. We have to be able to name what's hard without shame, whether that's an emotion inside of myself. I'm angry. I'm burnt out. This is what's true. The things that keep us from naming accurately are shame. And also another piece of it is I can't fix it. I don't want to name something that I can't fix.
Oh, you're into leaders' poison now. It's like,
right?
That's what we do. We fix things, right?
So I'm not going to name it unless I can immediately fix it. But sometimes the naming takes a minute. And so we want to name something and then fix it, right? And so what I started, and I just see this all the time with people. And so I'm always slowing people down. Could we just name it without jumping to fixing it? Well, then we need an intermediary step. And this is the step I call framing. And I think it's probably the most important step and the least glamorous step, the thing people want to talk about the least. We want to name it and then give ourselves a minute, depending on what's the nature of the problem, to frame it. And framing is that work of deeper reflection, looking at it, examining it from different angles. What's really happening here? You use the example. I use the example in the book of anger. I'm so mad at this person, right? I need to just tell him where to go or what to do or how to, right? But what if the frame is, I'm so mad at this person, and really what's happening is they haven't done anything wrong. I'm completely overwhelmed, and they just dropped a text into my day that I can't deal with. But it's not their fault. That's a very different frame that requires a very different course of action. And so that framing step is the step of all this work that we're talking about, of being spacious, giving ourselves some spaciousness to reflect on the different truth pieces of a puzzle. What are the different pieces? How do these pieces go together? And the more time I can give myself to do that, even if it's just a deep breath, right? Because I know we're busy, even if it's just a commute home from work, to turn off the radio, to turn off the podcast, and just be with my own thoughts, be with my own mind. for a second before I rush into action, that pause, that frame to frame the situation, I promise you, we will take a better action once it's time to actually be brave. So those are the three practices: naming, framing, and braving. Naming. And when any complicated challenge arises or any complicated set of emotions, pausing to name it without shame, frame it, and then brave it. Let's do something. I'm not saying we can't do anything, right? As a therapist, I think that braving step is really important. Leaders are great at that. But let's just pause and do some framing work before we brave it.
So one of the things you touch on is being numb in leadership. And that is, I think, more widespread than we admit. I had a season in my life where I was numb. I'm not numb anymore. You go through minutes where you're numb or hours or days. But generally my heart most days is working these days, which I'm very grateful for. Can you say more about being numb? This is something you've noticed enough to write about.
Oh, I think it's prevalent, and partly because we live in a world that is just filled with distractions and numbing devices ad nauseum, and it's really hard to unhitch from them. I think numbing is the opposite of naming. Numbing is suppressing emotions, suppressing awarenesses from our conscious awareness. We're suppressing. Naming is bringing truth pieces, I call them truth pieces, different aspects of what we're thinking about or feeling into our conscious awareness. So numbing is the opposite of naming, right? When I'm numbing, I'm like, there's something there I don't want to deal with. I'm going to push it down. There's a million ways to do that, right? Naming is, I don't want to feel this way, but I do. I don't have to fix it right away, but I do need to at least name it and honor it. And so, numbing is, again, not to shame yourself for that, but to the fact that you can name it and go. And again, there's degrees. In my first book, Boundaries for Your Soul, we talk about it's a Christian adaptation of this internal family systems where we're an inner family, and there are 3 parts to the inner family, and one of those parts is a number, is numbing and distracting and escaping. It's a part of us, and when that's in healthy balance, it might look like I had a hard day. I'm going to watch some shows and not think about it. Maybe I have a glass of wine or a beer, and I'm aware that I just can't deal with this right now. But then I wake up in the morning and I deal with it. That's healthy. That's healthy distraction, right? That's healthy comfort. That's healthy pacing. And I think that's important to say. It's not that we can't ever say, I need to watch a show tonight. I need to watch a mindless movie. I need to go do something mindless. We need that. When it becomes a problem is when we're never returning back to that original pain point, and we just keep piling on more and more and more. And suddenly we just can't not, binge the shows. We can't not drink. We can't not escape into our fantasy life. And we're never coming back to the original pain that needs to be named, right? And so numbing isn't, again, as most things in life, isn't all bad. There are moments where we need to, as you said, even strategically, I need to check out, I need to give my mind a rest. I need to, and there are healthy ways to do that. There are healthier ways than others, obviously, to do that. Taking a walk in nature, being in nature, doing something you enjoy, identifying the things that you love, the things that bring you life, right? Healthy pleasure, healthy comfort, healthy escape is so important to cultivate. But again, even when we're doing some of the numbing things, it's the frequency and the function of it. Are we using this instead of dealing with what's hard?
Choose your addictions. That's the way I always think of it. It's like there are healthy ones and there are bad ones.
Yeah.
Going for a bike ride is a good one.
That's right.
Getting out there and going for a walk is a good one.
Yep.
Super helpful. So, you know the church, church leaders. When you think about leaders, because you deal with so many issues in your book, you talk about envy, you talk about rivalry, low self-esteem, arrogance, toxic environments, etc. What are the top 2 or 3 that you see leaders struggling with again and again? Maybe, if you had to just have a few minutes to speak into the lives and the inner life of church leaders, what would you say you see rising to the surface? And then how would you encourage us to handle what we're struggling with?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think less than is a really hard one. We might not want to name it. And there, I see a lot of work to protect us from that. But that feeling of worth, it's hard to compare yourself to other leaders in a world filled. It's like mainlining comparison in our world these days, where it's really hard to just kind of be embedded in your local community, in your local space, in your local church, without being aware of what's happening, whether through social media or even just the news or the constant information of what's happening in someone else's neighborhood, miles away. We're just constantly seeing what's out there versus really just being embedded in our own little sphere of influence that really matters and is really meaningful. And so sometimes I wonder about that, right? That feeling of good enough or less than, and really doing the soul work around what is the path in front of me? What am I called to? What is that work before God and before these people that I am called to uniquely, and really keeping my eyes fixed on that, not shaming myself, but also not trying to keep up with others, right? What is the path that is in front of me? That's hard for all of us, but I think for leaders right now and leaders of churches, that's hard. That's really hard. So I think that's what leads to a lot of the burnout and a lot of the trying to compulsive availability, trying to be all things to all people when we're not anchored. And you know what? And also the other thing I would say is just because of all the information and because of all the knowledge, right, that we all have now, is just a pressure to be all things to all people, to know all things, to be all things. And one of the things I've really thought about a lot with church leaders is what are you doing well? What do you do really, really well? And really be aware of maybe here are the things we can't do or don't do or don't focus on. We think they're important, and there are other folks in the community doing these things. But here's what we do. Here's one or two things, that we do really, really well. And it kind of gets at knowing your lane, but I like thinking about it as a strengths-based approach. When I think about that Strength Finders, I love that model of, there's a couple of strengths I'm really good at. And, here are the strengths that are at the bottom of my list, and I'm at peace with those. And it's okay. I don't actually have to try to make those my top. I can lean into my strengths. So those are some of the things I work a lot with on ministry leaders is kind of narrowing the sphere of focus and being great at a couple of things and taking the pressure off yourself. And then cultivating those skills to really be aware of naming and framing your own sphere of influence and what you can do and letting go of the rest, and removing, setting boundaries with those channels that keep you in constant comparison mode and constant feeling less than mode.
So there's a lot of leaders listening who are not in the senior leader chair. And I get this scenario presented to me all the time, and it always breaks my heart, and I'd love your take on it. So you've got someone in the second chair, third chair, a couple levels down from the top who says, hey, my boss is not healthy. Like, they're constantly available. They expect everybody to be available. They're not very self-aware. Like, all the stuff you've talked about so far in this last hour, they're not even listening to the show. Or if they are, they think they're healthy, but they're not. What do I do if I'm in a toxic situation? Can you talk to that leader?
Yeah, so again, this is where a part of me wants to have the quick fix for everybody because it's so hard. And right. And I would say there isn't a quick fix. And also there are some things you can do toward the end of cultivating goodness inside your own soul that will ripple out into the community. So the first thing is just to name it. I know in the book I go through some of the toxic strategies that people use. Again, not to lay blame and not to even label people, but to label patterns of behavior. I think it's important to be able to name, this is a toxic pattern of behavior. This leader is blame shifting. They're not taking accountability. Can you give us an
example?
Yeah, blame shifting is one I see all the time where instead of taking responsibility, well, it's not my fault. There's too many demands, or it's not our fault. We have all this pressure from the outside world. Well, you're shifting blame, right? Instead of taking ownership. Actually, you're right. I am not great at managing my time. I make myself compulsive, and I get that is hard. I'm not able to change it on a dime, right? But that's a very different tone when a leader can name something and take responsibility for it instead of shifting blame onto other people. I think that happens a lot. And I think if you're under somebody who's doing that, it's really hard. And to be able to, I want to give you permission to name that pattern of behaviors. Gaslighting. I mean, it's such a buzz word. And I hesitate to bring it up, right? It's a buzzy word. But it really is just sort of this invalidation. Things are really fine. You're at its simplest form, it's you're saying this is not okay. This is what's happening in our church culture is not okay. It's fine. You're the one. You're overly sensitive. It's your problem. That's really toxic and painful, and that happens to people. So again, naming the pattern of behaviors is first, just to name it. Again, we don't have to fix it right away, but naming it is freeing. This is really happening. I'm not crazy. This is hard. And then framing it, right? Again, asking questions. How pervasive is it? How detrimental is it? Can I put some boundaries around it? The braving gets out. What are some boundaries I can do? Can I excuse myself from certain conversations? Can I set some healthy norms for myself, even if I can't change that other person? There's a lot in the book on that because there isn't a big one size fits all. But I would just say, first and foremost, to give you permission to name behaviors for what they are, and give yourself permission that you may not be able to fix it right away, but to stay very, very curious about what you're naming. How is that impacting me? How is that impacting other people? And praying into that with the power of the Holy Spirit. How can I push against that? Not to change the other person. Maybe I do need to have a conversation with that person. But the more you take your time to really assess, what's happening, what are the costs, what are the risks of speaking up, what are the costs to setting some boundaries? Could I lose my job? Really assessing those truth pieces, that framing work. When you do brave a path through it, it's going to be better and it's going to be more effective. Get help from outside the system is the last thing I would say. Always, I think it's helpful to have a set of eyes and ears on a workplace culture, especially if there's toxicity from outside the system, an objective third party.
So I'm very happy to have you nuance or correct what I'm about to say, because I give this advice so often. I would love just to test it against your expertise and see how I could make it better. Usually what I'll say to a leader in that situation is, wow, that's tough, kind of some empathy. And then I'll say a couple of things. Number one, just because they're unhealthy doesn't mean you have to be unhealthy.
Yeah.
And, you can be responsible for your own feelings. The other thing is, if you're let's say you're the student pastor, that doesn't mean you have to have an unhealthy student ministry. You can actually have health with your volunteers and you can model a different reality, a healthier reality within your church. And ultimately, one of two things is going to happen. Occasionally that will trickle to the top. Your boss will get curious and go, how can I be healthier? That I think has happened once in human history,
right.
Maybe twice. That's very unlikely.
That's right.
So then you're facing even a confrontation, very unlikely to produce change in that senior leader, just in my experience. So then you look at your reality. You've either hit a glass ceiling. This is the way it's going to be. And I can be healthy for myself and healthy within my environment, or you leave and you find a healthier culture. Any nuance to that?
I think it's excellent, Carey. And I think I really appreciate the wisdom, the hard-earned wisdom in what you're saying. In the book, I talk about three options. Almost always, we have three options. We can fight for change. We can leave.
Yeah.
Or the third option is suffer wisely. Yeah. And suffering wisely is often the path. But what we mean by suffering wisely is kind of to the point of what you're saying. It's like, this isn't going to change. It's going to be hard. And if it's so toxic that I can't do that, I got to leave. Yeah. Right? So that is an option. So if I've decided it's not so toxic that I have to leave, that I can't fight for change, it's not going to change. This person isn't going to change. So suffering wisely means, how do I mitigate the harm as best I can, support myself in ways that I need so that I can do my job well? And I often think that's the path, and it's the least glamorous path. But again, when we've done the work of naming and I can't leave for whatever reason, or I don't want to leave, I can't change it. This is the path. I think it gives us some clarity that we know what we're doing. We've counted the cost. We know what we're doing. This is the path ahead of us. And we can brave that path a little more freely and a little more lightly once we've done that work.
That's a great way to think through it. So we talked about a lot of things. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you want to touch on?
Gosh, we have talked through a lot of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I just want to encourage the folks listening that there is a unique cultural moment right now. I think it's hard to figure out how to be the body of Christ, be the church in this cultural moment for many, many reasons. And I would just encourage the listener, what an opportunity to go deeper into your own healing work. You don't have to fix the problem. Right? It's not any one of us is probably going to fix what's going on, but being more of who God made you to be, understanding more clearly what you do have to offer, the strengths that you do bring, how you can bring a pocket of health and light into this world is so life-changing. And people need it. I'm working with individuals. I need those folks, those healthy selves to have healthy communities to go back into, right? So your work is so important in creating that healthy culture, that healthy space. And as you do that, people are going to come because there's a huge need. So I just want to encourage the listener to keep doing your own work because it's what you have to, it's the best gift you have to give, not only to the people you serve, but to this culture.
Yeah, and health is countercultural right now in the moment we're in. It really is. So that's a great encouragement. Well, the book, great title, I Shouldn't Feel This Way. Dr. Alison Cook, thank you so much for being with us. Book's available widely. Where can people connect with you online? Easiest place.
Yeah, I have a podcast called The Best of You Podcast where I talk all things sort of faith and mental health. And dralisoncook.com is my website. And Dr. Alison Cook on Instagram and Facebook.
Okay. Where are you most active? Instagram?
Probably both? Instagram. Yeah.
Yeah, Instagram. Awesome. Alison, thank you so very much.
Thanks for having me, Carey. Thanks for all that you do.